Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello there. My name is Johnny. I have the opportunity today to interview Pastor John Torres. He is the director of Truth in My Days ministry. Today we will be starting a series on authorship of the gospel books. I hope this will be useful to you and that you may be able to learn and grow by it. The first question we're going to start then is, does it matter who wrote the gospel books and when?
Well, I'd say most certainly it does. The gospel books, which tell the story of Jesus, his life, his ministry, his miracles, and especially his death and resurrection, are actually the crux of the entire Bible. You've got the entire Old Testament there, which introduces God and the creation of the world, and then introduces the problem of sin, but doesn't solve it. Promises a new covenant in Jeremiah 31, but none appears. It promises a coming Messiah, tells us some things about him, but he doesn't come. So the Old Testament is not complete in and of itself. It's in the New Testament, and specifically the gospel books, that all of these are answered, where the Messiah appears, the new covenant is revealed, and the problem of sin dealt with. The rest of the New Testament then points back to Jesus and explains his work and its ramifications for us, and then finally explains the end of human history. So in light of this, we'd have to see the gospel books as the linchpin of the Bible, which means it's essential for us to know whether or not they are actually reliable, if we can trust what they say, their historicity. And so the authorship and the date of publication of these books is absolutely integral to the question of their trustworthiness. We have to know when they were published.
Okay. I hear this a lot. And in fact, I also hear this from when I went to seminary, is that we don't actually know who wrote the gospel books. I mean, there are speculations and there are some consensus, but it seems to be that the general consensus is that they're anonymous. And the names of the authors were in fact added long after the fact. And they were written, quite late, like 35 to 65 years after the events they were supposed to be describing. The well-known New Testament scholar, Dr. Bart Ehrman, even puts it in this way, and I quote, "How good are, brackets, the Gospels as historical sources? Unfortunately, they are not as good as we would like. The Gospels were written 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death, not by people who were eyewitnesses, but by people living later. The Gospels were written by highly literate, trained Greek-speaking Christians of the second and third generation. They're not written by Jesus' Aramaic-speaking followers," end quote. Now, is this true?
Well, you certainly do hear this sort of claim almost everywhere you look, whether you're checking Wikipedia or looking at popular magazines like Time and Newsweek and Maclean's, history documentaries on television. Virtually any secular source you would check would repeat these claims. But what you will notice, if you look carefully, is that they never offer anything in the way of real evidence for these claims.
So they're not true?
Absolutely not, on no count.
If that's the case, then we do know who wrote the gospel books and when?
Yes, we do. They were written in order by Matthew, also known as Levi, one of Jesus' apostles, the former tax collector. And the next one then was written by Mark, who was a co-worker of Peter and acted as his agent in writing his gospel book. The third was Luke, who was a Gentile, a physician, and a co-worker of Paul's. He was the only one who was not an eyewitness to the original Jesus, but did base his account on what was delivered to him directly by eyewitnesses. And the third and last was written by the Apostle John, one of the core group of the apostles, and in fact, Jesus' closest personal friend on earth. And that is beyond any sort of reasonable dispute. They were published early. We'll look at that in a future program, but the evidence would put Matthew to about AD 40 or 41, Mark to about 42 to 43, Luke to around AD 48 to 49, which would mean that all three of these books predated Paul's earliest letter, and then John would be probably in the year 64.
Wow, that is certainly very different from what I've heard in the past, and definitely very different from, I guess, the scholarly consensus.
Well, yes, indeed it is. And that's why it's necessary to look at the actual evidence and to go where it leads instead of uncritically following a scholarly consensus.
Can we do that? Go through the evidence?
Sure, but it is a big field, so I suggest we deal with it in what we can call manageable bite-sized sections. First, looking at how did we arrive at this situation? As how do we get to a situation where there's a scholarly consensus, supposedly, that so dramatically disagrees with what we're saying here? Then we'll look at the problems with the claims they're making. Then we would look at what does the actual evidence say about authorship. And then we'll move on as we get into dates as well. We'll look at what the actual evidence says about the dates of publication. We'll look at what does the actual evidence say about the order in which the gospel books were published. And that might seem like a triviality, but as we'll see, it's actually quite important. And then we'll close off with some observations on the evangelical response to this issue.
Ooh, looks like we got quite a task ahead of us, but it sounds good. I like to learn things in small bites so I can process everything.
Okay, then let's start with how did we get here? The first thing to notice is that the earliest Christians knew who wrote the gospel books and passed that information on. As far back as we go in the writings of the early Christians, the earliest generations of Christians, the church leaders who followed on after the apostles, all agreed that these books were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as we've said. And no one actually challenged this for a good 1,500 years or so. It was accepted. Things didn't really begin to change until we reached that period of history that's been dubbed the Enlightenment. And that goes back into the 17th century, an era in Western society where the growth of scientific investigation and other developments gave rise to a movement of philosophers who began to argue against the supernatural. In France, we're called the philosophes, and they also operated in England, Scotland, other places. And the idea of the Enlightenment to these people was that man is the measure of all things. We don't need God to explain things. It is now in our capability to understand everything about life. Science has the answers. Philosophy provides the rest. There's an influential school of philosophy called rationalism that said that all true knowledge can only come from the rational cogitation of the human mind. And so it frowned on ideas like revelation or holy books. Leading philosophers in the 17th century included people like Descartes and Baruch Spinoza. And then in the 18th century, we had Voltaire, Diderot, David Hume. And the goal, in a nutshell, of these philosophers, of this movement, was to drive God out of society. As we'll see probably in another program, it actually formed the root for the theory of evolution as well, the acceptance of that. There's an interesting quote I came across, and it's from Professor Edward J. Larson. At the time was at the University of Georgia and doing a lecture series called The Theory of Evolution, A History of Controversy, available in the Great Courses. And Larson is perhaps the world's leading expert on the history of the theory of evolution, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author on the subject. And in one of his lectures, he makes this quote. He says, during the Enlightenment, during, say, the 1700s, notions of evolution began creeping back in, that is, creation by natural law. If a people are intent in pushing out God or rejecting divine causation, really the only alternative is where species, well, they could be eternal, as Aristotle said, or they had to come from other species. Where else could they come from? End quote. The noteworthy part there is where he tells us what is the driving force behind the Enlightenment and behind the acceptance of the theory of evolution in general and in specific. If a people are intent in pushing out God, rejecting divine causation, that was the ethos that animated these intellectuals of the Enlightenment era. And this ethos necessitated attacking the Bible. If you're going to reject the idea of revelation and society holds on to the Bible's revelation, you have to attack it. Man is to replace God as the measure of all things. Belief in God, in particular belief in Christianity, had to be attacked. And to do that, they had to discredit the Bible. And so this gave rise to an academic movement that was dubbed historical criticism. Historical criticism can be defined as the study of the available evidence to determine the facts about the historical origins of the books of the Bible. Most important are the questions of who wrote them and who redacted them and when, and how much of it is reliable. And redacting means editing, the idea that the writers were not known. They took earlier sources and perhaps stitched and edited them together into the form we now have. And so that's historical criticism. And it sounds legitimate, but the problem with it is what was smuggled into this definition was, and that was the idea that there's no supernatural thing possible. We cannot bring God into the equation. So what they were really doing when they're looking at the questions of who wrote the Bible books and when and how, what they were really asking is, assuming they are not divine, assuming God did not inspire them, assuming that any account of something supernatural, a miracle, a resurrection, cannot possibly be true, with all these assumptions, what is the best naturalistic explanation for the Bible? And the field that looked into this is what we call liberal scholarship or liberal theology. Now, what was particularly important to them in terms of discrediting the gospel books, they absolutely had to insist that these could not be eyewitness testimony or even from eyewitness times. If they were, then they have credibility. If people are writing what they saw themselves, it becomes much more difficult for us 17, 18, 1900 years later to say, no, we know better. So it was job one really for them to deny the gospel books eyewitness status. And so it became de rigueur to claim that they were A, anonymous, not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and B, that they were written long after the fact, long after the eyewitnesses were dead. So when did these books written, when were they written according to the liberal scholars? Well, a certain very influential scholar from Tübingen University in Germany, which was the epicenter of liberal theology and historical criticism, a fellow named F.C. Bauer, told us that Matthew was published in the year 130, AD 130. Mark and Luke, somewhere in AD 150 to 160. And John, maybe AD 175 or later. Couldn't possibly be earlier than 160. Long, long after the fact. And you'd wonder, where did these numbers come from? What evidence did Bauer offer for these? Well, he didn't really offer anything. The sum total came down to his argumentation was to say, Christianity must have developed through a battle between the followers of Peter, who taught one thing, and the followers of Paul, who taught another thing. And they had to fight until they reached kind of a consensus view, an accord with each other, a new synthesis that became Christianity we have. And at that point, these books were written, which is not evidence, it's personal speculation. As far as the dates go, where did they come from? Why 130 and onwards? Well, it's just a date of convenience. Assuming Jesus died in the year 30, let's just add 100 years and make sure it's not in eyewitness times. And that's where the 130 came from. None of it came from evidence. And yet it was accepted, just based on scholarly credibility. The scholars say so, we have to accept it. I do remember the German historian Karl Becker famously said that the person who wins the argument is not the one who's right, it's the one who's arguing along with the ethos of society. They were very eager to push God out of society, so they were quite happy to accept these and promote them on nothing more than their authority as scholars. And remember, this was the assured results of critical scholarship. Assured results. John could not have been written before the year AD 160, final period, end of story. And they kept saying that all the way until 1936. And in 1936, a scholar named Colin Roberts found in the British Museum an old, tiny fragment of a papyrus manuscript. And it had been in the library for quite a while, but nobody bothered to look at and see what it was. And he realized, so he read the letters, and he realized this was from the Gospel according to John. Not a big piece, just a little fragment, but enough that you could know what it was. And this fragment, he dated to the year AD 125 or 130. He was essentially pushing it as late as he could. He could have dated it anywhere from 80 to 130. But either way, even at 130, it was 30 years before the earliest possible date that the assured results of critical scholarship had told us. Now, you would think at this point the credibility of critical scholarship and historical criticism would have collapsed. But it didn't. They just shamelessly kept on. They had to admit, though, that the gospel books all dated into the first century. They dragged kicking and screaming into that admission, but they did finally have to admit it. But they still try to put it as late as possible. They still insisted that these books were written decades after the facts, trying to push it as late as possible in the first century as they could. And they did have a new cutoff. They did have a date before which they refused to go. And that was to say that the earliest gospel book was written in the year 70. Eventually, they were willing to perhaps go back as far as 66.
It's very interesting. It's, listening to what you've said here, they're essentially basing their hypothesis on speculation, just so that they can push the gospel dates much later than the actual evidence. But you talked about now they're willing to move their date forward, and now it's actually quite a lot. Now it's over at 70 or 66. Why those dates now?
Yes, there's a very good book actually written by a now deceased scholar named Dr. Ada Lideman. She was a leading liberal scholar from Tübingen. She wrote a lot of books on this, and then she became a Christian, and she renounced all the nonsense she'd been spouting earlier, and she wrote a number of books on this. One of them, very, very good, it's called Historical Criticism, Methodology or Ideology, Reflections of a Bultmannian turned Evangelical, published by Baker Books in 1990, translated by Robert W. Yarbrough. And she really does a good job of blowing the whistle on how liberal scholarship works and how it elevates speculation into consensus and assured results without any kind of real evidence at all, particularly chapter 9 of the book. It's well worth reading. As far as the dates, they were forced in the first century by manuscript discoveries. The manuscripts forced them to admit it, and they would move it back in the first century, but not before AD 70 or AD 66. Why is that? Why did that become the new cutoff date? It's because of a prophecy Jesus made. It's recorded in Mark chapter 13, verses 1 to 2, Matthew 24, verses 1 to 2. And we read in Mark, then as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here." And Jesus answered and said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." It's a strange little idea of why would every single stone of the temple be torn apart. But he did make that prophecy, and history tells us that it was fulfilled exactly. When the Jews rose up in rebellion against their Roman overlords, led to a very nasty war that went on for 4 years and ended with the Romans taking Jerusalem, destroying the city, killing many, many people, and destroying the temple, to the point that every single stone was pulled off of every single stone, not one left. Well, if that's the case, then Jesus genuinely told a prophecy. If this was written before the date of fulfillment, what to the liberal scholars, it can't be. It cannot possibly have been a predictive prophecy because, remember, supernatural is impossible. So they will say that any book that has this prophecy of Jesus in it had to have been written after the fact. And that's why for a long time, that cutoff point was AD 70. They're willing to go back as far as 66 now to when the war actually broke out, because they would say, well, okay, a clever person could figure out that the Romans are going to trash the city. So, but that's as far back as they're willing to go. Nothing that would allow for supernatural.
But could they also argue, though, it wasn't necessarily fulfilled exactly? Because, I've seen pictures of, I think they call it the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, where there are many Jews gather to pray, and it's very interesting. They stick these little papers into some of the spots, the opening there. Isn't that part of the temple? I mean, that wasn't thrown down, right? So was Jesus wrong?
Actually, no. That the Wailing Wall was never actually part of the temple. It was part of one of the retaining walls. When King Herod embarked on this major building projects, including expanding and beautifying the temple. The temple is on top of Temple Mount. The Temple Mount, which obviously like a hill, is curved at the edges. And as he wanted to expand the temple, he needed more flat land. So what he had was retaining walls put around the hill and filled in with dirt to allow for more of a flat area and allow for the expansion of the temple. That wailing wall is actually the remnants of one of these retaining walls. None of the temple is left, not one stone upon another.
Wow, that's very interesting. And I think if we have the time, perhaps we can talk a little bit about what happened to that temple site, because I think there's actually another building there now. But anyways, so going back to the prophecy, Jesus was correct. He made a prophecy about the destruction of the temple, and it was fulfilled. But what does this have to do with the dates of the gospel books, though?
In reality, it should tell us that they were written before 70, not after. It would be reasonable to assume that if Jesus had foretold this, and the gospel writers are writing after it came to pass, that they would mention that it came to pass just as Jesus said. In Acts chapter 11, you have a prophet named Agabus, minor prophet, mentioned a couple of times in the book of Acts, and that's it. But in chapter 11, he comes to the church at Antioch and foretells a famine that will fall upon the Roman world. And we're told that was fulfilled. And that's what led to this mission of Paul to take relief to the church in Jerusalem. So if the fulfillment of even a minor prophecy like this is recorded, we would expect the fulfillment of a major prophecy like the destruction of the temple to be recorded. And it isn't. So we should actually see that as evidence that these were written before 70. Liberal scholars, of course, do the opposite. As we said, they reject the supernatural. They say Jesus could not have foretold the future, and therefore the books could not be earlier than that.
Yeah, and actually that makes a lot of sense, because especially, recently we had an election in the US, and there are always all these people making predictions, and they would include the result of the prediction if they had done it correctly to have it written after. So, but that's a good point. But you did say that they say it could be as early as AD 66. Wouldn't that still make it a supernatural prophecy anyways, because it's still before the actual event?
Well, as I said, from their point of view, no, they would think that while a clever person could see the writing on the wall, so to speak, the Jews have now risen up in revolt. They're bound to defeat. They're too clever by half on this, though, because it still would have a supernatural element to it. It would not be normal for the Romans or any conquering army to knock down every single stone from the temple. That would be an awful lot of work, and it wouldn't be necessary. So even if they're willing to go to 66 and they think we're keeping the supernatural out, they aren't quite keeping it out. There's an element of that prophecy that really couldn't have been seen in 66 even by a smart guy. But that then is how liberal scholars go about things. That's what brings us to this point, where scholars like Dr. Bart Ehrman tell us that the Gospels were written 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death, 35 to 65 years after his death, not by people who were eyewitnesses, but by people living later. The Gospels were written by highly literate, trained, Greek-speaking Christians of the second and third generation. They're not written by Jesus' Aramaic-speaking followers. And that, what we've gone over, basically answers our first question: how did we arrive at this situation?
Okay, makes sense. All right, and if I may try to sum it up a little bit, is if I understand this correctly, the desire was to elevate men over God, and that took root in the Enlightenment. Therefore, it required people to discredit the Bible, especially the gospel books, so that nothing supernatural in them can be accepted, because if they're eyewitnesses and they attest to the supernatural, that means they saw it, and that this couldn't have been allowed. So they had to move it out and date it late, so that they could deny that these were eyewitnesses and people actually saw these events occurring and recording them. And these claims that the gospel books were written by unknown authors 35 to 65 years after, as Armin has said, after the events they describe is based on their metaphysical bias and not through actual evidence. Is that correct?
Yes, I'd say that's a pretty good summary of the first point. We have said that they're basing it not on any evidence, and that's a charge we're making. So we will revisit that obviously as we continue our points and see the problems and see the lack of evidence and see where the evidence actually takes us. So as we move on to the second point now, recall, okay, we said that the gospel books are the linchpin of the Bible, okay? They tell us the account of the life, the ministry, the deeds, the miracles, and the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, let us set aside for the moment the question of divine authorship. We Christians believe the Bible is God-breathed and the writers were carried along by the Holy Spirit. But let's for the moment set aside that issue and look at the gospel books simply as historical accounts, because they certainly are that. Even skeptics have to concede that these are historical accounts. Well, for historical accounts, the reliability depends fundamentally on whether the authors were people who were in a position to know. Were they in a position to know what they're writing about? And the fact is that applies to all events from ancient history. And mostly now also, eyewitness testimony remains the gold standard in criminal trials. That's what we use there. Now, today, of course, we have cameras. We can take pictures and videos. We can fake pictures and videos, but not in the ancient world. In the ancient world, all we really have to pass on accounts of what happened was written documentation.
Okay. So, I guess written documentation sounds nice, but I guess maybe I watched a few too many movies, because isn't the archaeological evidence better? Like the discovery of, certain coins or even like these particular letters in their forms or something like that?
No, archaeological evidence isn't better. It's good. It's useful, of course. But in most cases, you need written documentation to explain their significance. You can find statues of ancient emperors, for example. You can find coins with their image on it and even the inscription saying who it is. And these, of course, can testify that these people existed, probably, because you can also find Greek coins with Zeus and Hercules on it, and they didn't exist. So these are helpful. But in most cases, without the written documentation explaining it, you don't understand it. Case in point would be Egyptian hieroglyphics. Well, as the explorers went through ancient Egypt, we found these magnificent pyramids, we found the sphinxes and these other structures. But we couldn't read their writing, and we didn't know about their history except what we had secondhand from Greek historians like Herodotus. We would dearly have loved to read it, but we couldn't decipher those hieroglyphics. It was too complex, too different. They had another form of writing they developed much later, kind of a shorthand for hieroglyphics called Demotic. We couldn't read that either. And it was not until 1798 when Napoleon was invading Egypt and his Army Corps of Engineers dug up a stone, a large stone, that's being called the Rosetta Stone. It had an inscription. It was written in hieroglyphic, it was written in Demotic, and it was written in Greek. And the Greek we could write. And so using that stone, a scholar named Francois Champollion spent 25 years and finally managed to decipher hieroglyphics. Once we had the written, then we could learn all kinds of things and understand what we found. Another case in point, the Mayans, we found their pyramids and all kinds of remnants. We couldn't read their writing. And it was used to be assumed that these were very peace-loving people. They're actually used to bash Christianity and show that pagan people could be very peaceful and loving and have a better society than Christians ever came up with. We couldn't read their writing. Once we were able to read their writing, we suddenly found out, they weren't peace-loving flower children. They were actually very warlike, aggressive, did human sacrifices and all kinds of nasty things like that. So really, you do need the written documentation. Archaeology artifacts can illuminate, but really number one is the written documentation. It is the king. But here too, with the written documentation, they come with varying degrees of credibility, just as eyewitnesses do in court today. Important question, obviously, is the person, as we said, was he in a position to know? Was he an eyewitness? Is he writing of things he personally saw? And if he did not, did he have access to eyewitnesses? Is he writing directly what was told to him by people who were direct eyewitnesses? And if not that, at least, well, did he at least live in eyewitness times where he could have gotten information from these people and where other people living at the time could have debunked what he wrote because they knew it wasn't true? So that's the question. Who do you trust? Who can you trust? Who's in a position to know? I'll give you a case in point. We're approaching the 50th anniversary of the 1972 Hockey Summit Series between Canada and the Soviet Union. Very, very big event in Canadian history. Probably the rest of the world wouldn't understand, but for us it was extremely huge. It's one of those things where any Canadian over a certain age could tell you exactly where he was when Henderson scored that series-winning goal with 34 seconds left to play in the last game. And there have been, through these almost 50 years, so many books published on the series, all kinds of different aspects. And I read so many of them. And then a few years back, some guy came to me, told me something about the series that I had not read in any of the books. He told me that in that last game, they're trailing 5-3 after 2 periods, and the players agreed in the dressing room that they would try to score a goal in the first 10 minutes, try to score a goal in the last 10 minutes, tie the game, tie the series, settle for that, and leave town. And the only reason they went for the winning goal was they heard from the Soviets that, oh, if the series ends in a tie, we will declare ourselves winners for having scored more goals. So they were willing to settle for a tie and leave town. I never, ever, ever read that in any book on the series. My question is, should I believe this guy? What do you think, Johnny? Should I believe this guy?
I mean, I guess depends on who he is, right? Like if I said it, then you probably wouldn't have any reason to believe it.
Exactly. You hit the nail right on the head there. Who said it? Well, who said it was Brad Park. Brad Park was the star defenseman on that team. He's definitely in a position to know. Came across him at a book signing in Chapters a few years back. And he's the one who told me that. Cool. And didn't see it in any book, but he was the player who was there. So I believe him. That's what comes down. The credibility comes down is the person in a position to know. So who wrote the gospel books? Let's return to Armin's statement again, looking at the third part of it. He says the gospels were written not by people who are eyewitnesses, but by people living later. The gospels were written by highly literate, trained, Greek-speaking Christians of the second and third generation. They're not written by Jesus' Aramaic-speaking followers. That's Armin's claim. But let's look at the evidence and see what we see. First question then, is there any evidence for the claims that these books were originally anonymous? They're certainly not anonymous now. They have titles: Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel according to Mark, Gospel according to Luke, Gospel according to John. The name of the author is right in the title. Do we have any evidence that these are later editions, that the books originally circulated anonymously? That's Armin's claim. What evidence does he offer? Well, he doesn't. He makes the assertion. The scholarly consensus makes the assertion. But what's offered in the way of evidence is exceedingly thin. First of all, if they were anonymous originally, if the author didn't mention his own name inside the body of the text, that would not actually be all that unusual for writings in the ancient world. Many histories written in the ancient world did not mention the name of the author in the text. Case in point, Annals, universally attributed to Tacitus, the Roman writer. It's considered among the finest, if not the finest, work of history from the ancient world, the Annals of Tacitus. But in point of fact, it's formally anonymous. The name of the author is not mentioned anywhere in the book. It's only in the title. And yet nobody doubts that Tacitus wrote this. So even if the gospel books were formally anonymous, the author's name not mentioned in the text, it wouldn't necessarily be an issue. But is that in fact the case? The assumption here is that those titles are not part of the original text. If they are, it settles the issue right there. The author put his name, and he put his name right there in the title. The assumption is that these were added later. But every single ancient manuscript we have of a gospel book, for which we have the first page, every single one of them has the title on it. So why would we assume that the title was not part of the original writing? If liberal scholars want to claim that they were originally circulated anonymously, the burden of proof is on them to produce some actual evidence, to produce one manuscript without the title, for example. But they can't. They don't. Perhaps some ancient testimony from some writer saying there are these books that Christians use, but they're anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. Something like that. They don't. This is the thing. They never offer any real evidence for these claims. And then remember this as well. If the first one was published 8 years after Jesus' ascension, and the next one 10 years after, there's only a 2-year gap. Even if the first one had no title, as soon as the second one is published, there has to be titles to distinguish between the two. So the writer of the second one would have put it right there, Gospel according to Mark. And then the first one would then have to have had a title added to it, Gospel according to Matthew, which would be just 2 years after its publication, where everyone knew who wrote it. So really the claim that they were anonymous already is standing on very, very thin ground just from the manuscript evidence alone. But further on, there are plenty of what we call early church fathers. These are early Christian leaders. People took leading positions in the church and wrote the history of the church, wrote apologetics books, and so on. There were plenty of them who were in a position to know, who tell us that Matthew wrote first, who tell us that Mark wrote Peter's account, that Luke was the companion of Paul, who wrote the third gospel book, and that John, the apostle closest to Jesus, wrote the last one. Plenty of them, including Papias. Paul called Papias, who was writing around the end of the first, start of the second century, so around the year AD 100. He tells us that he inquired of anyone who had spoken with the apostles because he wanted to know the facts. He met the apostle John himself, and further, he was a companion of Polycarp, who was a student of the apostle John. You know, of Irenaeus was writing around the year AD 180. He gives us a great deal of information on gospel origins, and he too was a student of Polycarp, who was a student of the apostle John, which means these were people very much in a position to know what they're talking about, certainly much more so than liberal scholars 17, 18, 1900 years removed from the fact.
Okay, that's that's definitely good evidence. But AD 180, that's still quite a long time, right? I mean, that's like 140 some odd years after the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus in AD, I think 33. Isn't that still too long for his testimony to count?
Yeah, you're talking about Irenaeus here, whose book, once you get this, was published around the year AD 180. I should mention, by the way, because I've referred to it a few times, published for ancient books. They're all handwritten. They didn't have printing presses. Published means released for public use. So Irenaeus around the year AD 180. And yes, that's 187 years after the crucifixion, resurrection of Jesus. You might think, how can somebody have accurate information after 180 years? It might seem problematic, but again, it really isn't. First, we're not dating from the crucifixion, but from the date at which the eyewitness spoke to the writer. If Jesus was crucified in 33 and then Matthew wrote in 40 or 41, then the cutoff point is 40 or 41. That's for having information on who wrote the book. Now, Matthew wrote in 40 or 41, but he could have lived till, say, 65, AD 65. And if he'd spoken to somebody in his old days, somebody who's young, say a 12-year-old, then that guy, he could have lived for quite a bit of time before passing on the information. So the question is this really too long for him to have accurate information? Well, I'll give you an example, which I found quite interesting myself when I came across it. But I saw a video on YouTube, an episode of an old game show on television called I've Got a Secret. This was the February 8th, 1956 broadcast. The way this show worked was they'd have a guest who'd have a secret. You'd have a panel of contestants who would ask questions and try to figure out what the secret was. Well, this particular guest, Dr. Samuel J. Seymour, he had a secret, and the guests, the contestants tried to figure it out. Eventually, they got it. They found out that Mr. Seymour was an eyewitness to the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. He was in Ford's Theater April 14th, 1865. He was there when Booth shot Lincoln. He saw Booth jump off the balcony, land on the stage, break his leg, drag himself out. He was testifying to this. Now, this was 1956. That's 91 years after the event, but he was an eyewitness. This was broadcast in 1956. Well, that's before my time, but it's not before my mother's time. She could have seen the show, and she could still tell you today. Today, we're 156 years after the assassination of Lincoln. But there would be only one link from the direct eyewitness telling my mom, and she could tell anybody today. So even one person get eyewitness testimony could span a period of over a century and a half. So very much Irenaeus, getting information from Polycarp, who was a student of the Apostle John, was very, very much in a position to know about the authorship of the gospel books.
Wow. Yeah, that's very good. Actually never thought of it that way. And in fact, now as you were explaining this, I thought about how we get to know a lot about history, for example. And I'm sure there are still a lot of people that can tell you about World War I and World War II, even though they're a very long time ago, because they have heard stories from people who were there and they carry that with them. But I guess it's easier for us to imagine now because we tend to live longer, right? But people didn't used to live as long. So is it possible that they could have stuck around long enough to pass on this knowledge?
Good question, Johnny. I'm not sure that many left who can still tell us about World War I, but certainly a lot about World War II. But this issue you bring up about the shorter lifespans in the Old Testament is actually a misconception. Lifespans, on average, were certainly shorter. But the reality is that plenty of people lived to a ripe old age in the Greco-Roman era. The reason the lifespans were much lower is because you had very high infant mortality, you had women dying in childbirth, and you had military service. Constant wars of aggression, constant putting down rebellions. A lot of people died in military service. But if you survived these three things, you had a good chance to live as long as we do today. According to Karen Cocaine in her book, Experiencing Old Age in Ancient Rome, published by Routledge in 2011, she writes, from around the 1st century BC onwards, the age of 60 or 65 was commonly mentioned as the threshold of old age. You just began to get old when you hit 60 or 65. Polycarp, for example, whom we've mentioned, tells us that he'd been a Christian for 86 years when he was martyred in AD 156. So in point of fact, there were many, many, many people who would have lived long enough to testify to these things. And so, yes, we have testimony from people in position of people like Papias and Irenaeus. There's others, Justin Martin, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, and others as well who testify to the authorship of the gospel books, who universally attribute them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which gives you another problem for the liberals who want to attack it. If the books were anonymous, you have this church all over the Roman world, and there's no unifying authority at this time, and nobody knows who wrote them, wouldn't different churches come up with different ideas about who wrote them? How would they all universally attribute it to the same 4 people? And if they're making up authorships, why would they pick these 4? John makes sense, sure. Matthew, less sense. He was an apostle, but not a prominent one. But certainly Mark, I was not an apostle at all, not even mentioned in the gospel books. And Luke, who was a Gentile, was not an eyewitness, was just a later companion of Paul. Why would you attribute universally the books to these 4, unless that's the information you had? Now, these people, I say, Papias, around the year 100, Irenaeus 180, and you said 147 years, that's late, and I showed you it's not. But if we go back to Annals of Tacitus, there is no external testimony that attributes this book to Tacitus until Jerome, some 250 to 300 years after the publication of the Annals. 250 to 300 years, and even then it's very indirect. And 250 to 300 years for external testimony is fairly quick for classical works. But for the gospel books, we have within 60 years and onwards. So we have the titles on the manuscripts. We have copious external testimony to the authorship of the gospel books, and we have these kind of minor considerations like how did the church pick the exact same four names if they were anonymous, and why would they pick these four?
Good point. I mean, yeah, but what do they offer in rebuttal? I mean, what do the liberal scholars say and skeptics offer in rebuttal?
Well, next to nothing, to be frank. We saw what Armin said. Again, the Gospels were written not by people who are eyewitnesses, but by people living later. That's a bald assertion. The Gospels were written by highly literate, trained Greek-speaking Christians of the second and third generation. They're not written by Jesus Aramaic-speaking followers. Do you see any actual evidence in there?
I mean, no. I mean, I guess he's suggesting that people could not have been good at Greek to write these.
Exactly. That's the only thing you can drag out of that entire statement that could constitute an actual argument, any kind of evidence, is the suggestion that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would not have had sufficient competency in Greek to write these books. But if that's what he's trying to get at, it's a non-starter. First, you don't notice this in the English translations, but you certainly notice it in the Greek. The quality of the Greek in the four books is not uniform, not at all. The Greek that you see in the Gospel according to John is simple, basic Greek. Mark also, not very sophisticated, not very complex. The Greek in Matthew is much better quality Greek. And then we get to Luke, it's magnificent Greek. Someone would say it's almost classical in quality, just this very complex, structured, very, very good quality Greek. Now that actually fits in perfectly with the traditional authorships. John was a fisherman. So he probably was a native Aramaic speaker, and probably maybe not highly educated. Now we do know that his family was not just a subsistence fishing family. His father, we read, they had hired servants. They had a kind of a fishing concern. So he might have actually been a bit more upper class. Mark, we don't know who he was. We're not told much about him. But the fact that Paul wanted to take Mark along on his first missionary journey, where they're going to go to Gentile cities where they would have to have communicated in Greek, suggests strongly that Mark did know Greek. Matthew was a tax collector, and it was a job requirement for tax collector to be very good in Greek, very literate, even able to write shorthand, what they called tachygrapha. And Luke was a Gentile. Greek was his mother tongue. And he was a physician, which means he might have been highly educated. And so, in fact, the quality of the Greek in the books matches exactly what we would expect from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The other issue, and perhaps Armin is a bit out of date on this, is the emerging evidence from archaeology and literary data is showing that the use of Greek in first century Israel was actually much more widespread than we used to think. Some scholars even suggest now that Greek might have been the dominant language in Israel in the first century. But even if it wasn't, we can expect that these people all spoke Greek as a second language based on the evidence. John, by the time he wrote his gospel, he'd been living among the Gentiles for decades and ministering to them. He must have picked up Greek in that time. And so certainly this argument really goes nowhere. If that's Armin's only argument, is that their books are written in Greek, if anything, it supports the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
This is definitely something I can relate, as a person who learned English as a second language. There's a very big difference in quality between my writing and your writing, and certainly my mother's writing and mine. So we all have different command of the English language. And I guess as Canadians, or we have Canadian listeners, especially those who live in Montreal, I guess in Montreal, it's a city like that where it's even though there's a huge French-speaking crowd, but in the city of Montreal, English is very widely used. So, yeah, no, that's a really cool observation that I've just learned here. But what about anything else?
Sure, and I do remind you, Johnny, English is my second language also.
That's true.
Okay, so do they offer anything else in the way of evidence for anonymity of the gospel books? Well, very little. One skeptic says this prior to the year AD 150. Quotations from or allusions to the Gospels were always made anonymously. In other words, they would quote something from a New Testament book, but they wouldn't say, Matthew says, Peter says, as it is written in the Gospel according to Luke. They're made anonymously. And the implied significance of this is that the reason they did this was because the names of the authors hadn't yet been attached to the books.
Is that a good argument?
Absolutely not. Because it was actually typical to quote from Bible books without mentioning the name of the book or the author. And nobody, not the most flaming liberal scholar, would suggest that the Old Testament books didn't have names and titles attached to them by the time of Jesus, that they were somehow anonymous. And yet, when you look at the New Testament quoting from the Old Testament, very much more often than not, they do it according to what this critic describes as anonymous, as they don't mention where it comes from. If you look at the book of Hebrews, for example, the epistle to the Hebrews, a lot of Old Testament quotations, 36 of them in total, that book. And not once does the author specify which book he got it from. They say, it is written in the scriptures, as you see in the scriptures. It is written in another place. But he never mentions which particular book. And that's Hebrews. 1 Corinthians, Paul quotes from the Old Testament 17 times and never once tells you which book he got it from or puts a name to it, quoting it anonymously, as our skeptic would say. And yet, there's no question he knew the titles of these books. 1 Peter quotes 11 times, never mentions it, attributes any of the quotations to a particular book. Now, sometimes they do. Matthew, for example, he does it 3 times. He quotes it as is written in the prophet Isaiah, but another 22 times he quotes without mentioning the writer. Book of Romans, 10 times, Paul quotes a book and says where it's from, what Isaiah says, but another 35 times he quotes from scripture and doesn't attribute it. So this was actually just the way they tended to do things in that time. So if these people before AD 150 are now mentioning the names, well, they're just following the style they see in the New Testament. There's no way that could be taken as evidence that there actually were not titles.
Actually, that's a good point. And as you're talking about this, I noticed that it's always nice to have the center colon reference version of the Bible, because in this way you can find the quotations much more easily. I remember when I first started reading the Bible, I didn't have that, and it was kind of tedious to find all of the references. And I guess it makes sense because these guys were talking to Christians. It's much like if I was preaching to a sermon or talking to a Christian brethren, I may quote scripture, but I may not always say where it is from exactly, right? So yeah, no, makes sense. So in conclusion, then I guess that there's such a voluminous.
Actually, just to follow up what you're saying there, people have Bibles, and the Bibles have nice chapter divisions and verse divisions. And it's certainly useful to find things. They don't seem to realize that, in fact, these were not there originally. Chapter divisions were not added to the Bible until the 13th century. Until then, try to find something. That's why Jesus says, have you never read in the scripture where it says? Because that's pretty much all they could say. You couldn't direct them to chapter and verse. So that was a very, very good innovation to bring them in. Interestingly, historical fact, it was brought in England by Stephen Langton. It was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was appointed after a battle between the Pope and King John, evil King John, who used to be evil Prince John from Robin Hood fame. And then it wasn't until the 16th century that verse divisions were put in, first by Robert Etienne, better known as Stephanus. So that's what made things easy for us now, but they weren't then. So just thought as a little detail of history that would be interesting to mention.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah, I guess it makes sense, because if it wasn't there, people wouldn't, I guess, just quote it the way we would do it normally now with, chapter this, verse that. So, okay. But in other words, there's a mountain of evidence that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the gospel books. and that this scholarly consensus that the books were originally anonymous is then essentially based on nothing.
Well, I'd say, yeah. I would say exactly. It's not based on anything. Nothing. Every once in a while, they throw out claims like this about the Greek or about anonymous quotations. So they every once in a while they will put something forth that prima facie might look like evidence, but even a little bit of examination shows that they aren't. They're based on nothing, and every once in a while you will find a liberal scholar who will admit that. Dr. Gerhard Ludemann, for example, he is one of the most prolific and respected liberal scholars of this day. He's written so many books, What Jesus Didn't Say, and all kinds of books attacking the historicity of the gospel books and attacking the credibility of Christianity. It's interesting in his book, What Jesus Didn't Say, you read at the beginning, and he writes this, quote, 3 presuppositions underlying my work are the following. First, the authors of the 4 Gospels of the New Testament are not known. Second, the authors were not eyewitnesses. So these are these presuppositions. They're not known. Second, the authors were not eyewitnesses. Any comment on that, Johnny?
Just seems to be a bunch of assertions rather than anything substantial.
Yeah, they are. And it's interesting also, it says the authors are not known, they're not eyewitnesses. Well, if you don't know who they were, how could you know whether they were eyewitnesses or not? So
it's true.
Liberals will trip themselves up very quickly and very often. But what I do want to point out here, he says 3 presuppositions underlying my work. Okay? Number 1, the authors are not known. It's anonymous. Okay? Second, the authors are not eyewitnesses. They're presuppositions. Well, what is a presupposition? Okay? What is a presupposition? If you look at the Cambridge Dictionary, for example, this is what comes up as the definition for presupposition. Something that you believe is true without having any proof. Right? Something that you believe is true without having any proof. And Dr. Gerhard Ludemann is basically admitting it's by presupposition that the Gospels are anonymous. So I believe they're anonymous without having any proof. Second presupposition, they were not eyewitnesses. Presupposition. So he believes they're not eyewitnesses, but has no proof. So every once in a while, the liberal scholars will admit that they're believing these without proof. Now, it's actually worse than that. It's one thing to believe something without proof. It's quite another thing to believe something against the proof. We have adduced, even in this program, several strong lines of evidence on this issue. Okay? Number 1, the manuscripts themselves have the titles. And number 2, we have external testimony from many people in a position to know who are telling us Matthew, Mark, Luke, John wrote these books. So from the position of liberal scholarship, it's not just that you have to assume they're anonymous and assume that the authors were not eyewitnesses. You have to actually discard the actual evidence. You have to ignore this external testimony. You have to ignore the titles. You could say, well, the titles were added later. I can't give you a manuscript without a title, but I still believe that. Well, they can do that, but they're going against the evidence, and particularly with the external testimony. They are having to ignore what was recorded for us by people in a position to know. They're saying, well, Papias says that, but Papias doesn't know what he's talking about. Papias is wrong. So Papias, who's writing in the time of eyewitnesses, he doesn't know, but the liberal scholar writing 18 or 1900 years later does know. There's a little certain hubris there, I would think. You cannot ignore the proof just because you don't like it.
Wow. I mean, not only are they basing, their academic field on presuppositions, but they're basing their eternal destiny on them. But it's even worse than that. I don't know if you would call this willful ignorance or just outright rejection, but that's terrible. And is this, I guess, the sort of attitude that is common amongst liberal biblical scholarship?
Unfortunately, it is. It is ubiquitous, I would say. You will find assertion after assertion, claim after claim, and very, very rarely do you see evidence offered for it. And where evidence is offered, it's usually like the sort of evidence we've seen here, where it really, the supposed evidence does not support the claim at all. It's very easily shown to be not evidence at all. And this is why you can never be satisfied simply looking up a Wikipedia article or picking up a book here and say, okay, the scholars say this, the scholarly consensus is that. You need to go by the actual evidence. Let me point out one more thing that's significant about biblical scholarship, okay? And that is the law of universal gravitation.
Okay, what does that have to do with biblical scholarship?
The law of universal gravitation, the force of attraction between two masses is equal to some constant g multiplied by the two masses and divided by the square of the distance between them. Discovered by Isaac Newton in the 17th century, though he couldn't figure out the constant, the value of g. That was left to Henry Cavendish, who discovered it in 1798 through an absolutely brilliant experiment. So now we have the law of universal gravitation. Force of attraction between any two masses is equal to 6.67 times 10 to the minus 11 Newton meter squared per kilogram squared times m1 times m2 over r squared. And why is this thing? What does this have to do with biblical scholarship? Here's what it has to do. You have the experts in physics, PhDs, experts in sciences, experts in astronomy. It doesn't matter if they're liberal or conservative. It doesn't matter if they're Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or secular or Jewish. They will all agree on that. Nobody will question it. It's a fact. Doesn't matter what their biases are, what their political affiliations, they will all agree. F is equal to gm1 m2 over r squared. But when it comes to biblical scholarship and other so-called soft sciences, you can have a guy with a PhD in biblical studies who will tell you Jesus rose from the dead, and you'll have another guy with a PhD in biblical studies from an equally qualified university saying, nope, Jesus died and his body was thrown to the dogs. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that biblical scholarship is not like hard sciences. When you have a scholarly consensus, you really will have two consensuses at least. Okay? And one will come from liberal scholarship, which assumes supernatural is impossible, and therefore will base their views of the gospel books and the Bible in general on this presupposition. They will be required to and will ignore the actual evidence. But anytime you have a field where equally qualified people can say the exact opposite things with a straight face, you know there's a problem, and you know you cannot simply accept a supposed scholarly consensus. You need to look at the evidence. That's what we do. That was the point I made in my debate with Shabir Ali last year. On my entire opening statement was the need to look at evidence, because Shabir would simply be bringing forth a scholarly consensus of liberal scholars to try to undermine the New Testament. And I couldn't simply say, well, but conservative evangelical scholars will say this. No, we have to look at the evidence. Our view has to be based on the evidence. And unfortunately, in all branches, not just liberal scholarship, but increasingly in evangelical scholarship too, we are coming up with consensuses that simply do not go where the evidence leads. So that's what you need to do. Okay? In this case, as we've seen, the evidence proves that the gospel books were indeed written by Matthew, the apostle, Mark, the companion of Peter, Luke, the Gentile physician, and John, the apostle, closest companion of Jesus. That's what the evidence shows. And that enhances their credibility as historical documents tremendously. And so to answer our open question, does it matter? Indeed, it does. And they come through, in terms of authorship, they come through smelling like roses. The same will apply when we look at questions like when they were written, the dates of the gospel books, and other issues as well. And so that's I'm hoping that this is useful for you and that you see the importance of it. There are a lot of forces out there that want to discredit gospel books. It's been on for a long time. It's going on now. But rest assured, the evidence supports the fact that they are indeed reliable and we can trust them.
Nice. I think this is why I'm very thankful to have an engineer as a pastor, a man of science who knows exactly how to examine the evidence and go to the conclusion where the evidence leads us. And I think hopefully in the future, we will have more segments that will address this issue, because I think as far as the actual evidence go, I think these days, very often we tend to trust in narratives or consensus rather than being told what the evidence is. So, and in terms of coming to faith in Jesus Christ, in terms of trusting the Bible, this is of crucial importance because this is where our eternal destiny lies. So thank you very much for going through this topic on authorship. And thank you very much for listening to our program today. This is Johnny signing off with our pastor, John Torres, and we look forward to share with you in our future segments. Have a good day.
Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torres. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.